All right, it's working. Shall I start, or do you want to do any initial welcome greeting, wherever? Okay, I think I'm going to start, Camila. Is it okay? Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. We're supposed to proceed with our discussions following the schedule, which was already posted on both on the syllabus and at Moodle platform. And the idea is that today I would say a few things about this decolonial critical theory of AI, artificial intelligence. So in order to provoke your critical thinking, I'm going to share a few slides with you guys. Please let me know if you can see the whole thing when it's projecting there, right? So the title is A Decolonial Critical Theory of AI. This is part of an ongoing research project. I sent one published piece, which is not definitive in the sense that there are not only some typos or mistakes in the translation, because this paper had different versions in French, Portuguese, and English. But the English version wasn't the first one that I presented there at this Barry event in Italy. That's when Judith Butler was awarded an honorific doctorate honoris causa in Italy. This paper reflects an ongoing interdisciplinary research program in critical theory, normativity, and naturalism. Since 2013, we always use dates just to make sure that no one's going to say, well, you had this idea yesterday. No, it's been over 10 years working in this research program, having revisited several issues of neurophilosophy, or philosophy of neuroscience, as we like to say here in this seminar. We use both terminologies. Broadly conceived, also covering neuroethics, ethics of AI, and networks, and neural networks. Problem here. In particular, the so-called social brain problem. This was the name of one of the phases of our first CNPq supported project at the Brain Institute, and now arguing for a decolonializing perspective of critical theory capable of enabling an increasingly deliberative, participatory, and egalitarian democracy in Brazil and Latin America, making use of new digital technologies. So there are lots of things already to say about this whole thing of decolonizing critical theory, but I won't. Okay, I'll leave it there, and as I'll proceed, you guys will get some more provocations for your critical thinking, because it is we should have some kind of a discussion. Let's see. Yeah, we will have enough time for that. Its kernel comes down to promoting intersectional egalitarianism, not only of socioeconomic status, but also of gender, sex, race, ethnicity, species, and environment, comprising both flora and fauna, through digital inclusion in a radical immanent critique of advanced capitalism. And so the major names here are like the ones on the first slide: Marcuse, his most famous doctoral student, Angela Davis; Monique Wittig, a French uh, gay philosopher who passed away over 15 years ago. But she translated Marcuse into French, and she did some interesting contributions to queer theory and gay philosophy. Camille probably could say more things about her work because it has been translated to Portuguese. I saw several of her books translated into Portuguese. Sheila Benhabib, Nancy Fraser, Andrew Finberg, Judith Butler, Amy Allen all argue that the most defensible and efficient way to tackle the so-called value alignment problem in AI is to confine its normative thrust to moral values insofar as social epistemic justification is concerned. So value alignment, of course, for people who are not philosophers, they immediately think, oh yeah, ethics. But no, we are philosophers. For philosophers, you cannot take it for granted, right? Value could be economic value. It could be metaphysical value. What kind of value are you talking about? So this is the first problem for us, which is not, and this is one of the reasons why I'm going to have some disagreement with Rosalie Williams' paper, why critical theory is, why AI ethics is critical theory. To allow for a naturalist account of sociality in neuroscientific terms, so that social norms might be regarded as customary rules of behavior that coordinate our interactions with others and be fairly represented as equilibrium of suitably defined games. So this is a very long discussion. I'll leave it there, and we can talk more about this later. In this presentation, I'll confine myself to outlining the normative challenges of AI today, especially focusing on the value alignment problem and articulating it with the AI governance problem in critical theoretical terms, especially the problem of moral, political, and legal agency. Now, this distinction between moral, political, and legal, it's also very important for a theory of normativity. Recasting the Foucaultian terms of subjectivation and Judith Butler's conception of performativity. This is what I did for the presentation in Italy. So that the normative claims of a critical decolonial theory be combined with a naturalistic worldview within a research program on mitigated social constructionism in response to the phenomenological deficit of normative and naturalistic theories. So the normative deficit is the starting point. But let's move on. Why Hannah Arendt, Michel Foucault, and John Rawls belong to a feminist critical theory of liberalism. So this is more like a critical theory problem, but as someone who cannot claim women's discursive standpoint, in Portuguese, lugar de fala, in the first person, hence the phenomenological deficit, I am seeking to understand the radical contributions of feminisms to a decolonial critical theory of AI. Given my socialization, including my hybrid ethnic religious background, I would like to better understand the seminal contributions of plural feminisms to the moral grammar and paradigm shifts, I put in brackets terms, in parentheses, because it's part of the research. I had some slides for this, but I think I'm going to break this down in two presentations. Okay, I'll do at least half of it today, because the whole thing for the hermeneutics of subjectivity, which was the thing I presented in Italy, we'll talk about linguistic turn and conversion, both in terms of spirituality, as we have in religious conversion, but when you talk about linguistic turn, okay, like in philosophy, you say that Habermas undertook the linguistic turn. In Foucaultian terms, this is like a conversion, not in hermeneutical terms, okay, because it's a metanoia, as they say in Greek, from liberation to decoloniality. So it's a paradigm shift, especially how feminists can help us to address what we might call the phenomenological deficit of critical theory in naturalism in an intersectional approach beyond normativism and reductionist approaches to both neuroscience and the humanities. Okay, because the whole thing of human nature, everything you might think in terms of nature, natural science, neuroscience, etc., you could place within the category of naturalism. But if you talk about normativity in a more, let's say, foundationalist sense, but not necessarily. But in philosophy, when you speak of foundations, it makes a lot of sense, because if you think of Descartes, for instance, conception of the cogito, you think that he had a foundationalist approach to the sciences. His method, Discours de la méthode, right, the discourse on method, was an attempt to build up a metaphysical foundation for all scientific endeavor. And several centuries later on, someone like Edmund Husserl in phenomenology will do a similar thing. And that's why he wrote the Cartesian Meditations, right? Because he was also trying to come up with he didn't use the word metaphysics as, in this sense, but he thought it would be an alternative to Kantian transcendental philosophy to avoid both objectivist and subjectivist approaches to the same problem, the way he put it. Both, for instance, psychologists in empiricism and logicism in the Cartesian side. This was beginning of 20th century. So my reference here to Sheila Ben-Habib, to this first important landmark of a critical theoretical approach to feminism from 1987. You see, again, the dates are very important. Ben-Habib was already doing this as early as 1982, when she was responding to John Rawls and Habermas. You know, she had a Humboldt fellowship to spend 2 years in Germany, and she was assistant to Professor Habermas when she was there. You're going to see more. It's going to become clearer as I move forward. So here we have Rawls, Habermas, Foucault, and Hannah Arendt. It was a different presentation, but it's the same kind of a problem of bringing Rawls to the discussion. Here we have feminism, and my contention here is that feminism, I'm especially focusing on Sheila Ben-Habib's contribution, but you might say lots of things about Butler and Fraser in this sense. They did contribute in a very decisive way to make sense of alternative approaches, for instance, to post-colonial critical theory, as Amy Allen did, or to bring together naturalism and normativity, okay? Because this was the title of my research program, Naturalism, Normativity. Analytic philosophers were doing this, especially with Rayuton, and folks from the University of Michigan, also from anyways, we even had a big meeting in Pelotas. I recall this with Juliano. He was a former student of ours, and he got a position at Federal University of Pelotas. And we had a big meeting on a big seminar on naturalism. And we had a volume that was issued back then. So this is my provocation here. Why AI ethics is definitely not a critical theory. Of course, the first reason is that AI ethics is one thing, which is applied ethics. Critical theory is political philosophy. So you cannot equate ethics and political philosophy, even though these two things usually go hand in hand, but you cannot say that they are the same thing, or even say, well, political theory is some kind of applied ethics, or applied ethics is some kind of political theory. This would be a category mistake, right? Although I will not seek to focus on the ecological aspects of applied ethics stemming from Spinoza, Hans Jonas, and the value of life, so the whole thing of philosophy of biology, which is also important for Foucault. Last week we had Federico Testa's excellent presentation on Canguilhem and Foucault, which gives you an idea of this context in the 60s in France. Jacques Monod, Francois Jacob, all these contributions to philosophy of biology on the continent. I'd like to start with a rapprochement using a Whalen 2022 article between AI ethics and critical theory to proceed within a decolonial and an emancipatory reformulation of the ethical normative problem of value alignment towards the implementation of a digital democratic ethos. I'm assuming that democracy and its normative-laden values are inseparable from their social milieu, which can be understood as an ethos at once a human character and a human dwelling. So the Greek word allows for both translations that can also entail a human destiny. This was Heidegger's insight, as famously expressed in the Heraclitean dictum, ethos anthropo daimon. The character of human beings is their destiny, or their fate, their daimon. Just to recall that Hegel translated this fragment, daimon is a Geist, spirit. We can thus revisit the dialogue de Sourds between Habermas and Foucault, the death dialogue, rehabilitating their common avoidance of Heidegger's reductionist critique of technoscience, especially when applied to social institutions, including communication, language, and politics. Therefore, I'm proposing to revisit Habermas' critique of Marcuse and bring him closer to a Foucaultian conception of technologies of power as a form of power. Foucault's contention that one must embrace the Nietzschean correlation between power and intersubjective valuation to make sense of modern forms of governance is what ultimately takes us from metamorphosis of subjectivation, from disciplinary contractualist power, Foucaultian analysis of power, to neoliberal regimes of biopolitics as unveiled by a decolonial normative reconstruction. AI cannot, after all, be equated with critical theory, as if political theory were reducible to applied ethics. What Foucault called governmentality is precisely what accounts for the technological recasting of digital governance in new liberal times, as subjectivity self-interpreted in cyberspace and social media. So you have to tackle these three questions. What's governance, what's ethics, and what is a value alignment in AI ethics? So there are many common sense approaches to the idea of ethics and human conduct, social behavior, for instance. Do the Right Thing, Spike Lee's movie in the late 80s. Ex Machina, which is by all accounts one of the best AI ethics movies I could think of. and Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, which came out last year. But of course, there are many other movies like Blade Runner, the two versions of Blade Runner, Matrix. There are many, many movies that the Matrix trilogy is a good example of a movie that relates to philosophical issues in philosophy of mind. But what ethics is not, always relates to, starting with etiquette, right? If you know how to properly use knife and fork, doesn't make you ethical, but it's a good etiquette. But it is somehow related to this because, of course, it has the whole thing of social behavior.
Yeah. Little ethics.
Yes, yeah. Right. Yes, yeah, literally, right, yeah. Right, etiquette, right. That's a pretty good remark. Convention, valuation. The other day we had this, it was actually with the Federico's presentation, had a whole discussion on convention. Anyone coming from a legal background would understand this easily because, as you know, the Stoics and ancients used to oppose law to nature. Nomos, law, convention, as opposed to physis. And this is very questionable nowadays, all right, with this neuroscientific turn, etc. Valuation, religion. Of course, some people say, well, of course, ethics cannot be reduced to religion. Well, let's be honest. Lots of people do think of ethics in religious terms. They usually think of the Ten Commandments as, and it is a model of, it's an example of ethical behavior or ethical normativity. But we have to keep in mind that both for Judaism and Christianity, primitive Christianity, whatever is ethical about the Ten Commandments was not differentiated, to use Habermas terminology that Sheila Ben-Abi points out is very important to do normative reconstruction. There was no differentiation between the political, the social, the institutional, etc., all the different levels of a complex modern structuration of society. That's the point that Habermas tried to make, as opposed to Durkheim's employment of representation, for instance, of religious sociality. So social, anthropological, psychological, behavioral description, okay? Usually philosophers will fight over this important differentiation between description and prescription. Modus vivendi, etiology, and ethology. I'm very grateful to Jason Yonover for his research on Spinoza's etiology. He was in Paris when I did my presentation on in this medieval philosophy event, 2022. And he actually did his doctoral dissertation on this, and with Yitzhak Melamed. And it's a very fine piece of work. I totally agree with this reading, especially to say that Nietzsche was the one who better understood Spinoza among German philosophers. Usually, Hegel and others are or even Schopenhauer are more cited, but Nietzsche is the one who precisely understood this whole thing about flock behavior. That is, in Freudian terms, we have psychology of masses. How Bolsonaristas in Brazil behave like cattle, right? But Lulistas are not different, just change the political orientation, right? Because it's a whole thing of social psychology, right? Ethics from the Greek ethos, character, custom. So it has been defined in analytic terms, for instance, from Oxford Encyclopedia or Dictionary of Philosophy, philosophical study of morality. This is good enough. But now you have to define morality, or morals, as the British put it. Set of codifications of human conduct, way of conducting oneself in human relations, customs. Aristotle reminds us that ethos with epsilon and ethos with eta are correlated philologically and philosophically. This is in the Nicomachean Ethics. In Greek, which was also translated from the Greek to English by our good friend Roger Crisp at Oxford. Ethos with epsilon, Aristotle says, means custom, as we'll find later in a metaphysics of customs, for instance, metaphysics der Sitten in Kant. And ethos with eta is an older form, as we find it in the pre-Socratics, for instance, in Heraclitus, in that fragment 119 that we just mentioned, meaning character. And so far as all ethics, ethic in Greek, presupposes social, political, and legal institutions through which virtues and moral values are cultivated, ethics is correlated with politics. So this is my, it was already my thesis, my first treatise, the ethical political treatise, because not everyone agrees with this, especially religious people, because they think ethics, when you go to the bathroom and you do something forbidden, okay, but I don't think this is really important for philosophical reflection. It could relate to other things that Freud explains, right? Even utilitarians and contractualists, therefore, not only communitarians, and again, let's make sense of this. Contractualists are usually identified with liberals and universalists. Think of John Rawls, okay? And they often labeled or mislabeled as individualists, recognize that ethics is correlated with a collective social dimension of the community, of social, political, and economic traditions and institutions. Sandel was the most important critic of Habermas, of Rawls, of his 1971 theory of justice. Charles Taylor, Alistair MacIntyre, and Michael Walzer, who was contemporaneous with Rawls at Harvard and together with Nozick. It's a very important discussion between Walzer, Nozick, and Rawls relating theories of justice. Virtue ethics, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, these are the most traditional teleological model. It's the most known teleological model. Then you have consequentialist ethics, of which utilitarianism is the most known, because you take the good as a telos, right, for virtue ethics, Aristotle and Plato, and you say that the principle of utility is the telos, is the ultimate end, as Mill, Bentham, and in our contemporary philosophical scenario, Peter Singer did. Deontological or duty ethics, as Kant inaugurated this tradition, and Rawls and Habermas would fit into this kind of approach. And of course, we have all the hybrid models. My proposal is that in order to tackle value alignment, you need hybrid models, meaning that none of these three major normative ethical models will be sufficient. They could be even necessary to a certain extent, but they won't be sufficient to take care of the normativity problem in AI ethics, because there are many other issues involved with it. For instance, as we learned from philosophy of mind, in meta-ethics, for instance, you have the problem of free will. And Spinoza is a very good example, just like Nietzsche. And that's why Jason's contributions of etiology was very helpful, because it's a matter of behavior, in that people might think that, no, well, we are free. Of course, everyone is free. I can raise and whatever I want to do. But this is not the whole picture of a free will. And Spinoza's takes on free will might well be an instance of a Moore's paradox, as Melamed put it. Necessitarianism is true, but I do not believe it. It's raining, but I do not believe it. So these are the more like paradoxes. There is objectively no free will, but we still believe it. So there are many quotes. We could talk about Damasio. Damasio wrote a few interesting lines about free will. So again, the Heraclitean dictum, this fragment, I use this fragment since my doctoral dissertation. That's why I'm repeating it. It's very important for me and for my own idea of doing ethics and political philosophy, or doing philosophy overall, because it has the whole thing of human nature. And when I first started reading Heidegger, I knew that I had a lot to learn from Heidegger, and I think we all do have a lot to learn from Heidegger, even if we do not agree with everything he did say about worldhood. You know, it's a major concept in being in time, in order to make sense of this idea of Umwelt, of environment. So AI ethics can be taken both in a broad sense and in a narrow sense, okay? Just like Aristotle's idea of episteme. So AI ethics relates, therefore, to bioethics and neuroethics, or applied ethics. But you may think of other forms of applied ethics that could be also important for AI ethics. For instance, environmental ethics, business ethics. Usually, when you talk to people at Technopuc, right, the Technological and Science Park at PUC, they'll say, well, how about principles of fairness? As Camila talked about this in the last seminar. So these are business ethical being used and appropriated also by AI ethics. Engineering ethics, lots of things related to LLM engineering ethics. Computing ethics, same thing. Governance. Governance is the only point, therefore, where I would see this interface between critical theory and AI ethics in a way that I could understand that someone would resort to the idea of governance. But this is not what critical theorists did. As far as I can tell, this is Foucault's contribution, which is not even accepted by everyone. Okay, we're going to see this later on. Neurolaw, of course, neurolaw from the very beginning was there. As I mentioned, Jesse Prince and the others, Pizarro, that's the other guy from Harvard. He was here, or Cornell, he was at Cornell. I don't know if he went to Harvard first or after he came to Rio. But anyways, Nadelhofer was the other one. All these folks were working on neurolaw. They were doing also work in neuroethics, in bioethics. And of course, my major contention here, my working hypothesis is that sustainability today plays a similar role to metaphysics at the time of Aristotle. I know this is very heretical to say. Some Aristotelian could kill me for this, but we can have more conversation about this later on. Now, the most important thing to understand about this association of AI ethics and robotics ethics, as we have in IRIS, AI, robotics, ethics, society, is that the first law of robotics that dates back to the 1950 Asimov's bestseller, I, Robot, already made into a film with Will Smith. A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. So this remains the golden rule, of the most sacred principle for all the other ones that we derive from it. And now we're going to realize that beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice, as Camila presented last week, the four principles of bioethics, are also resorted to in order to approach fairness, justice, freedom and autonomy, trust, sustainability. They use this as a value, as a major ethical value, dignity, solidarity, and of course, the two principles added by Luciano Floridi, who is also on Facebook, explicability and interpretability. So this is the pop culture icon here is Dr. Smith with the Robinsons families robot. This was my first meeting with a robot on black and white TV in the 70s when I was a kid. But it was also from my childhood that I first saw 2001: A Space Odyssey. Of course, I didn't make much of it. I was about 8 years old. But of course, I get an opportunity to see over and over again this movie. I recommend to anyone. If you haven't seen it, you have to see it. It's a must-see movie. But if you've already seen it, see it again and try to get these at least the parts where you have the whole thing of how this kind of a supercomputer. And let's keep this in mind that we didn't have supercomputers back then. Okay, but already it was IBM was the major computer company all over the world, and HAL was one letter shift from the name. You see, IBM, HAL. Friendly artificial intelligence is hypothetical artificial general intelligence that will have a positive, benign effect on humanity, or at least align with human interests, or contribute to fostering the improvement of the human species. So this is just to make sure that we can unpack each one of these problems. We won't have the time to do this. It's another interesting flick thing to see. A classic by Walt Disney, Fantasia. It's also from the 60s, if I'm not mistaken. The Sorcerer's Apprentice, where you had Mickey Mouse doing that wizard's apprentice, disastrous reproduction of an experiment. And this is why it became a dangerous thing. And Eliezer Yudkowsky used this as a metaphor, was very interesting, has been referred to by anyone who reads about value alignment. So AI alignment movements based upon two ideas. First of all, in the story with Nick Bostrom at Oxford, right? The orthogonality of intelligence and motivation in artificially intelligent systems, keeping in mind, as Professor Bostrom likes to put it, intelligent systems do not necessarily have human-like motivations, of course. And secondly, instrumental convergence within autonomously pursued goal systems. So the whole thing of cognitive enhancement. Boy, I'm running out of time because I want to have a discussion. Now, you go straight to the whole thing of a critical theory, which in my research programs, that's where I came from, right? I always keep repeating this just to make sure that I began with research in critical theories when I was doing research for the influence of first generation critical. Well, it's more correct to speak of a Frankfurt School critical theories like Walter Benjamin, clockwise, from left to right clockwise, Horkheimer, Adorno, Bloch, and Marcuse. And these were some of the inspirations. I was amazed to see how Marcuse's contribution to liberation. I'm so glad that Professor Finberg, that's why I'd like to, it'd be very nice if he could make it. No, I'm going to insist that he was mentioned in this presentation, if he could make it to Porto Alegre, because his contribution of rehabilitating Marcuse now at the beginning of the 21st century is very important. Liberation is the most used term, more than emancipation. Just to give you an idea, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. Only for the sake of the hopeless ones have we been given hope. And this was quoted by both Ruben Alves, Gutierrez, and liberation theologians were very fond of this idea of a hope theology, because, of course, hope together with faith and love are one of the most important cardinal virtues for Christians. Now I heard from Robinson Hayes from Santa Maria that he's conducting research on the phenomenology of hope. This is very interesting because it's a very interesting topic for liberation as well. Reason is the organ of, and for utopia, right? For utopia as well. Reason is the organ of calculation of planning. It is neutral with regard to ends. Its element is coordination. So this is part of Adorno and Horkheimer's reputed critique of modern reason, or his dialectic of Aufklärung. We are not born yet. There are many writings by the young Bloch. This one from 1918. You have to see the year it was published. His Spirit of Utopia. It's translated into Portuguese, and Professor Susana Albornoz is a Brazilian, most important researcher on Bloch to this day. How can the individual satisfy her needs without harming herself? So this is one of Marcuse's writings on liberation. He has two more. And this is the major writing by Sheila Ben-Habib that was decisive for my own pragmatist turn and feminist turn in critical theory. The claim that the changing role of the father in the family would necessarily generate a weak, passive, and atomized self has been criticized by feminist thinkers as the patriarchal core of Frankfurt School thought. Can you imagine this? This was published in 1986. So it's like we're talking 30 years later about this whole thing of evolution. Sheila was very insightful. Some of the things, as you go back to this book, I say, we have to spend a whole semester starting with the reading of this book, which is a major publication in feminist critical theory, but I would say also in the way that deconstructing Frankfurt critical theory, paving the way, for instance, for Allen's post-colonial approach to Frankfurt critical theory. Because Ben-Habib is here reviewing the way Jessica Benjamin utilized the results of object relations theory in psychoanalysis, very similar to what Finberg is doing now with Marcuse. Because just to keep in mind, Marcuse's Eros and Civilization is correlated to his writings on liberation and one-dimensional man that Camila mentioned last week. And therefore, you have the same problem also when you go to theories of the self from a psychoanalytical standpoint. I won't develop this here, but it's interesting to say that someone who wants to do this, it's possible to do it. Judith Butler, of course, she was the one to be honored with this presentation. I'm very grateful she came to my presentation. In this speech act, the one which for a time relieves the phrase originary freedom, liberté originaire. And she's very good at using the original, because certain sense are lost in translation. Now, like Camille and myself realized this last semester in our Foucault seminar, from the epistemic politics within which it lives, which also performs, right? This is the word I want to call your attention to, perform. Because performing, which has also a component that would link Butler to Habermas, can you believe that? It's Chomsky's idea of performance. Vicente probably knows more about this than us, because it's very used by Kohlberg and psychologists, theoreticians working with performance in the way you perform when you have certain competences, right? Competence as opposed to performance, right? And therefore, sometimes it's lost in translation. When you do the translation of this very passage in Portuguese, performs, translate as realizar or something, so you lose it. It's very important to keep the original. It's not to say that, there is something magic. There is nothing magic. It's just in any language, you have polysemic interesting, tricky situations. And that's why some philosophers, and Butler is a good example here, use certain terms that could be very decisive to making sense. Now, another one is care. We saw that Fabien Buger kept éthique du care en français. There is no such word in French. You have souci or soin. But says we have to keep care because when you say souci or care or soin in Foucault or in a nurse, someone, a caretaker, someone that's taking care of your mother, of an old person, you lose this. But in Portuguese, no. In Portuguese, okay. If you say cuidado, it's pretty good. Okay, cuidado is perfect. You use it for Heidegger, you use it for Kohlberg, and you use it for ethics of care, ética do cuidado. I just say that polysemy doesn't work for every language. That's a problem that everyone should keep in mind. So Sheila Ben Habib's approach to what I understood is already my first rehabilitation of immanent critique. She didn't make this explicit, but this is something else. It's very important that we give credit to Professor Ben Habib, because when she published this book, a lot of people didn't make the connection between immanent critique and normative reconstruction. Actually, a book was just launched last year by a very important Brazilian researcher and a good friend of ours, Luis Repa, on normative reconstruction, but he doesn't mention any of this. He doesn't mention Dewey. So there are several things that are missing. And this is very important. The method of rational normative reconstruction was first mentioned by Habermas in 1973. So the dates, just for this reason, it's not to do historical, but again, it was a historical reconstruction, like Sheila says in her book. She's doing a historical reconstruction of Frankfurt critical theory, but not for the sake of a historical account. She want to think of the problem of normativity in the shifts from first generation to second generation, because this was everything we had at that point. Now we have to keep in mind, Axel Honneth wasn't known at all at that time. She was one of the persons who read Professor Ben Habib's manuscript. You have to keep this in mind. The dates say that, well, Honneth's struggle for recognition came out 10 years later, okay, when Achille was doing this research with Habermas. The aim of such reconstructive science is to make individuals aware of the rule competences which they always already practice as an implicit know-how. Okay, here is everything. As I mentioned, the competence in Chomsky is the ability that a child will have to speak a language. And you bring this child to China, she will develop Mandarin, Cantonese, or Chinese language. If this same child were raised in England, she will function in English. She will speak English fluently. Like German kids speak German fluently. And it's so hard for most of us to go there and learn German. Well, this is Noam Chomsky's hypothesis. And it's been very successful. Anyways, it's also controversial, his generative grammar. But reconstruction served the task of self-reflection in the sense of making individuals aware of what they already know. So it's a matter of making it explicit. This is another word we associate with Robert Brendam's book, which bears this title. But Habermas was already using it. That's why Habermas was very fond of Brendam's book, right? Because he was the first one to use this expression. So reconstructions carry on the task of transcendental philosophy. This is Ben Habib writing with modified means, page 264 of Critique, Norm, and Utopia. Just as transcendental philosophy sought to make individuals aware of those necessary presuppositions which operate in all their acts of cognition, reconstructive theories analyze the deep structures of cognition. When you talk about deep structures, again, this could be very helpful to hermeneutics, deep hermeneutics, including deep ecology, cognition and action, which are operative in the activities of individuals. Again, in Critique Norm in Utopia, page 273, I quote, in reconstructive sciences, reconstructive science replaced transcendental philosophy today while attempting to accommodate Hegel's critique of Kant. So this is very interesting because Ben Habib realized that also Rawls was talking about a post-Hegelian return to Kant. They produce an empirical phenomenology of mind, tracing the development of ontogenetic and phylogenetic competencies. So it could be both in terms of the evolution of the species. This was actually the starting point for my research program when I brought Habermas' reconstruction of historical materialism. This is a 1976 book by Professor Habermas, and his 1999 book, Between Naturalism and Religion. That's where he explicitly talks about social evolution vis-a-vis neurobiological evolution. He doesn't use the neuro, right? He only talks about biological evolution. But in our approaches here at the Brain Institute, we thought of the evolution of the neocortex. The account of modernization's rationalization presented in the theory of communicative action relies upon this concept of a reconstructive science. To combine the internalist with the externalist perspectives in social theory, Habermas utilized the concepts of a developmental logic and learning process. So this is very Deweyan. Reconstructive science, as in Chomsky, Piaget, Piaget is the other fellow we should mention, and Kohlberg, which was the starting point for Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice and her Ethics of Care, the detranscendentalization of reason. This is precisely the feminist critique, as I'm saying here, that Ben Habib is very much along Gilligan's feminist critique of Kohlberg, meaning roughly that the knowledge achieved through rational reconstruction is not necessary, but hypothetical, not a priori, but empirical, not certain, but fallible. Okay, this is very interesting for philosophy of science. Anyways, in our research here, in our research programs at the Brain Institute, I'm going to quit very soon. We undertook the neuroscientific turn. We gave credit to the founding women of neuroethics, starting with Patricia Churchill. It has to be said. She first used this terminology, neurophilosophy, some 40 years ago. Edina Roskis was the first one to do a systematic research on neuroethics, and Martha Farah at the University of Pennsylvania, still doing this today. In psychology and neuropsychology and neurophilosophy. So from bioethics to neuroethics, already a neuroscientific turn of moral philosophy. This is what Foucault would call a conversion, okay? Hermeneutic conversion. So the shift from MRI towards fMRI, right, where you have the brain's function being measured through the activity of blood flow changes associated with different thoughts, etc. And Vicente is going to do a presentation for us. Camila, we can just schedule the best moment for his presentation. He's conducting fMRI experiments at the Brain Institute. And keep in mind that not all neurocorrelates are causally correlated, of course. Yeah. But this is very important. This is very important because it's not only for neuroscience. It's for social philosophy, for many other things. It's a typical, let's say, it's a fallacy right? That happens to many of us. AI is the new hype in town, as we can see the number of people using social media. And today there were some publications I keep resorting to these already published texts, because this was the first time I published anything on normativity. Naturally, there was a publication in English and a publication in Portuguese. It was the second volume of this trilogy in Portuguese. And in my current research program, I'm, as I mentioned to you, I'm trying to develop three manuscripts on this whole thing, bringing together critical theory and this neuroscientific turn in a decolonial critique of artificial intelligence. So the starting point is here. I think I'm going to stop here because I sent you guys the article. Most of this stuff is already in the article that you probably read, or if you didn't read it, please take some time to read. And I'm going to send you also the PDF version of this PowerPoint presentation so that you could explore some of these theses and hypotheses. Let me just make sure that I'm not going to leave anything out. So this is the starting point I mentioned between naturalism and religion. Actually, was 2005. 1999 was truth and justification, right? Which is also very important in order to make sense of Rainer Forst's theory of justification. Didn't fall from heaven, of course. Forst was Habermas's student when he was writing his major thesis on context of justice. And Reconstruction, that's the other book I mentioned to you guys. That's when I first read about Reconstruction. I remember I was doing a discussion of this book with Ken Baines. He was my advisor, replacing Professor Ben Habib, who left for the new school, and then she went to Harvard. And at that point, we're reading the whole thing of this social evolution vis-a-vis biological evolution. And the whole thing of bringing the immanent critique of the dual system life world. This is part of my criticism of the phenomenological deficit in critical theory. And that's why I go back to Heidegger, because there is a very important hermeneutic feature that is lost, and Professor Honneth made it possible. That's why I keep showing this slide, because it was the first time I publicly used this expression, the phenomenological depth of critical theory. And Honneth thought it was interesting. Well, he was grateful that I'm saying that he was one of the guys who was trying to fill in this deficit, right? It's like a gap that has to be filled in. And of course, his theory of recognition, and even more, if you think of Foucault's hermeneutics of subjectivity, or if you think of now Butler and all the different all the feminist contributions go in the direction of filling in the phenomenological deficit of critical theory. Because if you want to have an embodied, embedded, enactive, extended, and emotive cognition, and we can multiply the number of E words, right? You can have environmental, right? It's not there, but you can put environmental cognition. It makes sense here, because environmental in the Heideggerian sense of Umwelt, milieu. Irreducible first personhood, both in singular and plural persons, which means it's also intersubjective. That's precisely what Professor Honneth was trying to do with a theory of recognition. And finally, these two slides on Professor Finberg's latest publication. I'm going to be sending you guys, because it's important to have a discussion about this. Marcuse arguably offers the most usable version of critical theory. So his thesis here is that both Honneth and even forced, they were very, he doesn't mention forced, but I did in my comments. I mentioned to Vicente that there was a discussion on Facebook, and Professor Finberg, now that he's retired, he could post some interesting critical comments on Facebook regarding his book, where for Marx, the ultimate purpose of the revolution was recognition of human potential in all its forms. Marcuse now casts an even wider net that encompasses potentiality as such in both humanity and nature. That's the whole thing. It has an environmental dimension to it. So the whole thing of the one-dimensional man becomes even more interesting. That's the point that Professor Finberg is trying to make, and I think he succeeds. And finally, this last slide, like the Frankfurt School, Foucault sought to address the betrayal of the Enlightenment promise of freedom in a totally rationalized society. He called this the fundamental problem we're all struggling with. However, Foucault's approach was informed by detailed historical research. He did not trace the oppressive form of rationality back to a capitalist origin, nor did he propose any measure of oppression other than the resistance it provokes. Foucault has inspired much further research that goes well beyond Marcuse's remarks on management science, for the technological society. For example, Wendy Brown has developed a Foucauldian critique of neoliberal political governance. And again, Foucauldian, you have variants because of the French Foucauldian, but this is a French thing. And since I'm not a pedantic Paris jerk, I'm not going to say that. You have to say Foucauldian, Kantian. Okay, if you're doing my presentation in French, I'll probably use it. But in Portuguese and English, I always use Foucaultian with T, but I very much respect who resort to a more French version of it, while showing concretely how rational economic criteria infiltrate the state and society. So I'll stop here and open the floor for discussion. And as I said, these slides will be available in PDF format. So I'll make Professor Camila Palhares Barbosa the host and moderator for this discussion. Camila, please go ahead.
Hi, the audio is off of both of you.
Let me just check that will
Okay,
not
now I'm
have
hearing.
Yeah, you can hear now?
Yes.
Yeah, for us came a little bit of a echo throughout it. So I was wondering if you could not just equate AI ethics to critical theory. That's a very strong affirmation that is the same as, right? Or if we didn't have anything from critical theory to question or to help think about AI ethics. Because I see a lot of papers calling this social deficit on AI ethics, especially to do with autonomy. That we think about the act of decision, not the social conditions where a decision can potentially be made, right? This is even in the liberal discussion, like Sam and Martha Nussbaum bring the social conditions to an act of choice, right? And another is not clear to me. I think that probably we'll continue this discussion in another class and throughout our seminar. But how to, which kind of decolonial criticism we will do to AI ethics, even as an applied one? Because here we saw a very traditional philosophy, not a decolonial approach, even of decolonial philosophers doing this approach. And I'm not saying that because I don't think we can use them to do a decolonial criticism, but that we should bring at least some sort of decolonial philosopher research resource to make this kind of claim of who we could bring to the discussion to make a decolonial approach that not only take the traditional philosophical authors and this kind of thinking, because although we can use them, I think we should be adding more and considering this kind of criticism that is not broad enough just to keep arguing through Rawls and Habermas. We should bring a more decolonial and different perspectives too, right? Because one thing that to a decolonial approach to AI ethics that I have been seeing is like, especially in AI governmentability that you brought in some slide, because these decisions, these acts to AI governmentability is being brought in international institutions, organizations that have rich countries doing the whole scheme, right? So this discussion of how this kind of dynamics and AI governmentability, Birham did make this argument, is a new kind and a new language to colonization, because they bring up to, we should use AI to develop this country throughout this norm. So to AI ethics to not be Western, apply ethics to what we consider development countries, right? So that's the problems that I keep in mind to how we can use a decolonial approach to help this kind of dynamics. Because as we showed in our paper here at HICE and IRIS, we don't have much being produced from, for instance, America Latina, right? So I think that is still a challenge, how we can think from our context to expand and to participate in the AI discussion. I know it's probably a lot to not specific
lots
to the
of things.
presentation, but I'm very interested with the discussion.
And I do appreciate your, is it okay? Can you hear me? Okay, I do appreciate your both sets of comments and questions, and I grant you that I totally agree with both of them. First of all, for the whole thing of equating critical theory with AI ethics, or vice versa, AI ethics as critical theory, it was more in order to provoke the to buy into the provocation by Rosalie's paper, that she was the one who came up with this provocation. So I'm just responding to her. No, it's not the case that AI ethics is critical theory. It is not, because applied ethics is not political theory. That's all. But I understand that you can say, oh, no, she wasn't doing this. It was only the title in order to make it more. And that's true. It could be only the impact. It's a catchphrase to call everyone's attention and say, wow, not critical theory. Because when you read the paper, you see that she's not equating in this very silly sense. But there is also something that seems to be inferring that applied ethics could be taken as a political theory, because lots of people may resort to this approach. And I respect that everyone is allowed to defend whatever they want to defend. And it was in another publication. It was, I think it was in the piece on Habermas, Rawls, and the whole thing of Sheila Ben Habib's critique of Rawls, that It's been published as an article that I mentioned. Raymond Goes, he was the one that first called my attention to the fact that applied ethics cannot be taken for political theory, which means that other people were doing the same kind of mistake. And I agree, it's a category mistake. So I maintain my position that I do not agree with this, but I'm not saying that she was only doing this, equating in a very, let's say, dogmatic sense. No, she's not being dogmatic. There is more than just equating AI ethics with critical theory. But on top of this, the whole thing of the normative dimensions of sociality, this is precisely what was part of my research program from the very beginning. This would be another paper because it has already been published in English. It was in Sinara Naira's philosophy journal, Principios, where I was trying to come up. Well, remember I used the stop sign and say, well, which one would be more fundamental? If you say that critical theory, AI ethics is critical theory, you can do this if you are Kantian. But this would be problematic for critical theories, right? Because it's like assuming that if you defend, for instance, transparency, interpretability, or you name it, no, 11, it doesn't matter how many principles you're going to use in this meta-analysis. You can have as many principles as you want to use. The thing is that which ones or which one you're going to say it's the most fundamental in moral epistemic terms, to think in terms of Professor Plantinga's basic beliefs, because this would be a foundationalist approach. It means that you have one ethical, one example of ethical normativity, and from there you can infer political, social, legal, etc., all kinds of institutional arrangements where you can claim normativity. So this is precisely what I'm saying. I am not convinced about this procedure or about this approach, because in my own understanding of it, there is no way you're going to take one of them as being the most fundamental and all the other ones will be derived. I don't see how you can do that, unless you are very dogmatic, but then you fall back into normativism, as I was saying. And I think that even in roles, and then I go already to the second question, because I'll have to go very soon. The second question is precisely that I was only doing a very quick draft of some of these problems, because in one of the slides I mentioned that we need a moral grammar of decoloniality. This is where you can think of what would be a more, let's say, authentic Latin American, Brazilian contribution. But in my personal opinion, from everything I did with liberation philosophy, Hispanic philosophy, the APA meetings in New York, we had a research group would meet every year in the last week of December. It was always during the Christmas, New Year's break in New York City. And my personal position is to be very suspicious of anything like, saying, well, we're going to have Ubuntu, just to give you the most known. So what the hell is Ubuntu? And you talk to different African colleagues, and Ubuntu is everything. If Ubuntu is everything, sorry, you're not going to help us in this. Because it doesn't help to say you have a magic word. I'm not looking for any kind of buzzword or magic words. So that's why liberation was good enough, because it's the idea of freedom. And again, it's one of the volumes of this trilogy, is what I would call Decolonial Critical Theory of Liberation. Because decoloniality is simply revisiting some of the problems were already present with liberation philosophy and the very challenge of coming up with a Latin American original thinking. And I can tell you guys what happened when you had these discussions. One group of folks would say, well, we're gonna go back to some native indigenous word that it means everything. I won't go in this direction. I respect very much people who do that. I can give you the reference. There was one particular guy from Mexico. He was the best one of all because he realized it's not the best thing to do. For instance, Viveiros de Castro is a very good example. It's very helpful to know about the Yanomamis and other indigenous cultures. I myself, I come from an indigenous background. So I could be, making a claim and saying, well, get me a job because I'm black, I'm a native Brazilian. No, it's not the point. It's not, I'm not making a case in terms of identity politics in this sense, even though I respect, and that's why the very origin of this term, phenomenological depth of critical theory, was in a paper on affirmative action. This is very important. But the terminology, the fact that we are talking in English, it could be Portuguese. Portuguese is also European. And my thesis, precisely, let me make this very clear, that's why I have to go back to Spinoza, is that there is no sacred origin for anything. If we use the Hebrews, now with the Gaza-Israel conflict, to say, oh, you see, now it's the promised land. Well, promised land was the good excuse to invade the territory. But the Portuguese were not any different from this, or the Spaniards, or the French, or the English who went to North America, okay? So that's why I think Spinoza and later on Derrida would be the one that would call into question the primordiality in Heideggerian terms. Say, well, if you go to this, no, there is no such a thing. I mean, you can do that if you want to do, but I am not. Please, I'm out. I won't follow you. If you want to do this, okay, you go with your Heideggerian tribe and do this kind of research. I'm not interested in this kind of stuff. So liberation is okay. I'm going to be arguing that the most recent contribution to a theory of liberation, Theorie der Befreiung, by Christoph Menke, he's going to be here in São Paulo. He's a great thinker, but I totally disagree with his book. And it's a thick book. And I bought the book when I went to Bonn a couple of years ago. And it's a very good book, very interesting, but it has an aestheticist solution to the problem. To say, well, nobody is going to be ultimately liberated from everything. Of course not. But only German idealists or romantics would believe in liberation in this sense, ultimate liberation. No, this is not what I'm talking about. Liberation is a very practical, particular word that could be used in very given concrete situations. Think in France, libération. It was the liberation from the Nazis. It was a given situation during Second World War. If you think of women's liberation movement, animal liberation, all the liberation that Marcuse is talking about, they are concrete social movements, as you mentioned. That's why I told you, it's not only the new social movement, even the old social movements, they were always struggling for liberation, even at Marx's times, the workers in England and so forth. So I agree, it's very tricky, but I don't think that you have to create a new word or say, well, in Portuguese, we say saudade, and no one can translate saudade into English, German. It's not true. You can have some equivalent translation, but what? You're going to use a Brazilian word, say that now this is going to solve all the problems in ethical normativity. No, I'm not going to try to propose a new word. I think that freedom is good enough. Liberation, decoloniality are revisiting this idea of freedom, and they have different mythical narratives, like the Pesach for Judaism. Okay, it's the most important festivity for Judaism, is the festival of liberation during Passover, right? Pesach, or Easter for Christians. But again, this is one kind of example. Brazil as a country was dominated by Judeo-Christian motifs. It's good enough to think of liberation and the fact that you have so many inequalities. But I agree, Camila, I take your critical remarks very seriously, because I am aware that it's no point doing all this criticism and said, well, now let's go back to Rawls and Habermas. Of course, it doesn't make sense. My idea is here precisely to resort to feminist critiques, as you'll find in some of these authors I mentioned. You see that Professor Finberg tried to do the same thing by mentioning Wendy Brown. It's the same thing. Brown is using Foucaultian categories to develop a critique of neoliberalism. So I think it's very helpful to do this kind of thing and to do a modest contribution. I don't think that Decolonial, but I totally agree, and this is my last remark, that our response to the North-South divide, in which has been monopolized, it's not only dominated, monopolized by North Atlantic folks, in AI ethics, should be critiqued in Benabid's sense, because she draws a distinction between criticism and critique, right? So this is a critique, as in critical theory, of North Atlantic domination. And I have to stop here. Thank you very much.